a woman risked her life to save a tiger cub clinging to the edge of a cliff. Months later, when a deadly landslide buried her deep beneath the mud, something unbelievable happened. What the tiger did next left everyone speechless. Amelia had always felt a connection to animals, one that ran deeper than simple admiration. From the time she was a child growing up in the outskirts of Chennai, she'd found solace in the company of strays, nursing injured birds back to health and talking to cats as though they understood every word. It wasn't surprising to anyone when she pursued wildlife conservation. Now, at 28, she was starting her first assignment at a remote nature reserve in India nestled deep within the Western Ghats. The park stretched over hundreds of kilometers, its thick jungles echoing with the sounds of monkeys, birds, and predators. But among all its creatures, it was known most for one thing: its Bengal tigers. There were just over 24 of them in the reserve. Powerful, graceful, and elusive, they ruled the land with silent authority. The rangers seldom saw them up close, though camera traps and field reports showed that the population was stable. For Amelia, the idea of working in such proximity to these magnificent beasts was nothing short of a dream. She had arrived only 3 weeks ago, but already felt the rhythm of the wild pulling her in. Each morning, she woke before the sun and set out with her camera, notebook, and a mind full of anticipation. Her routine had become a blend of responsibility and awe. She would drive through winding forest paths in her rugged old Jeep, stopping occasionally to inspect paw prints in the mud or listen for unfamiliar bird calls. On this particular morning, the sky was just beginning to glow with the soft orange of dawn. The forest smelled of damp leaves and early rain. A layer of mist hovered over the canopy as she guided the Jeep toward one of the more remote areas of the park, an elevated ridge known for its rocky terrain and occasional sightings of tiger cubs. Amelia had studied the terrain carefully before going. The area was filled with large boulders, scattered trees, and sharp drops that overlooked deep ravines. It wasn't the safest place, especially during monsoon season when landslides could occur. But it was also a known spot where tigresses brought their cubs to play and practice climbing. She had hoped to catch a glimpse of that dynamic, perhaps from a safe distance. As she approached the area, the mist began to clear. Sunlight filtered through the trees, highlighting the rocky surfaces ahead. Then she saw them. 3 tiger cubs were darting in and out of the rocks, their striped coats flashing with every playful leap. They pounced on each other, rolled in the dust, and scrambled up and down small ledges with clumsy excitement. Amelia turned off the engine and stayed still, watching through her binoculars. Her heart swelled at the sight. There was something deeply joyful in the way they moved, unaware of how dangerous the cliffs nearby could be. She scanned the surroundings, searching for the mother. A few moments later, her eyes settled on a larger figure lying in the shade of a stone outcrop. The tigress was resting but alert, her gaze fixed on her cubs. Amelia knew that mothers in the wild were fiercely protective, and any sign of threat could trigger aggression. That's why she remained quiet, merely observing. Suddenly, one of the cubs chased another too close to the edge. The rocks beneath them had been weathered by rain and time, and Amelia noticed a slight shift in the surface. A piece of stone crumbled under their feet. The cubs skidded to a halt. One made it back to solid ground, but the other lost its footing. It tried to turn, but its hind legs slipped over the edge. For a few terrifying seconds, its claws scraped against the cliff's surface before it managed to cling to a narrow ledge halfway down. The tigress stood up immediately, growling in distress. The remaining cubs backed away from the edge, confused and scared. Amelia's instincts kicked in. She grabbed the radio and called for backup, her voice low but urgent. Help would take time, and the cub didn't have much. Its small form was barely holding on, and any sudden movement could mean a fall straight down to the rocks below. She reached for her bag and pulled out the emergency rope kit, her fingers working quickly. She had trained for situations like this, though she never imagined having to use those skills on her own. The cliff wasn't very steep, but it was jagged and unstable. Getting close enough to help would be dangerous. Amelia started moving toward the edge, staying low to avoid startling the tigress. She hoped the animal would stay back, at least until the cub was safe. The cub let out a soft cry, its body shaking. There was fear in its eyes, but also something else, something like trust. The tigress paced behind it, clearly agitated but not approaching Amelia. There was a moment of shared understanding between woman and beast, unspoken but deeply felt. As Amelia prepared to lower herself toward the cub, the sound of distant engines echoed through the forest. Her team was on the way. But until they arrived, she was the only thing standing between the cub and the fall. Amelia inched closer to the edge, every step deliberate and cautious. The loose stones beneath her boots shifted with the slightest pressure, and each sound reminded her of how fragile the terrain had become. Below, the tiger cub struggled to hold on, its front claws embedded in a narrow ledge, hind legs dangling in the air. The space between the ledge and the drop beneath it was terrifyingly deep, filled with jagged rocks and thick undergrowth. A fall from that height would be fatal. Her breathing slowed as she examined the best angle for descent. She knew she couldn't rush. A single misstep could start a rock slide that would take both her and the cub with it. She set the rope anchor around a sturdy tree a few feet from the edge, then looped the rest around her waist and shoulders with practiced hands. Time was pressing, but every knot had to be secure. The cub whimpered again, its tiny frame trembling. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the tigress still watching. The large cat had not moved closer, but her tail flicked back and forth with unease. Amelia hoped the tigress wouldn't misread her actions as a threat. A charge now would end everything. She kept her movements low and non-threatening, her gaze mostly on the ground as she shuffled to the ledge. The wind picked up, rustling the treetops above and sending dry leaves fluttering past her face. The morning light, once golden and warm, now seemed pale and cold. She secured her footing, tested the rope again, and then lowered herself slightly over the edge. Dirt crumbled beside her boots and disappeared into the void. She could now see the cub more clearly. Its fur was matted with dust and its breathing was fast and shallow. Its back paws scraped helplessly at the rock face, but it didn't cry out anymore. Exhaustion had started to set in. Amelia spoke softly, though she knew the words wouldn't matter. Her tone, calm and steady, might offer some comfort. Her hands gripped the rock as she used it to lower herself slowly, careful not to dislodge any more of it. When she reached the ledge where the cub was clinging, she planted her boots as firmly as possible. The space was tight, barely enough for both of them. She reached into her side pouch, pulling out a small harness made for transporting injured animals. She had used it before on deer and stray dogs, never on a wild predator, let alone a tiger cub. But she had no choice. With slow movements, she extended her hand toward the cub. It tensed but did not move away. Its eyes were wide, filled with something that resembled understanding. Amelia knew better than to believe the animal trusted her. It was more likely frozen by fear. But in that stillness, she had a chance. She slipped the first loop of the harness around one of its front legs, then the second. When she reached for its midsection, the cub flinched and let out a sharp growl. Amelia paused, gave it a moment, then tried again. This time, the cub allowed her to fasten the harness. The final strap clicked into place and she exhaled slowly. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her hands steady. The sound of tires crunching on gravel reached her ears. She glanced upward and saw a few figures gathering near the edge. Her team had arrived. One of the rangers leaned forward and gestured toward the rope. She gave a thumbs up in return and secured the harness rope to her own. The plan was simple: lift the cub first, then she would climb back after. The rope tightened as the team above began to pull. The cub was startled at first, its limbs flailing, but the harness held firm. Amelia steadied it with her hands as it began to rise. Inch by inch it ascended, swinging slightly as it neared the top. The moment its paws touched solid ground, the tigress rushed forward. There was a moment of tension as the large predator approached the rangers. But to everyone's relief, she stopped just short of the group, focusing entirely on her cub. She sniffed the young tiger, then licked its face with slow, heavy strokes. The cub whimpered in response, pressing itself against her. Amelia waited a few seconds, then began her climb back. The rain from the previous week had made the rocks slippery, but with help from above, she reached the top without trouble. She collapsed to her knees, mud streaked across her clothes, her arms shaking. The other rangers offered her water and checked her for injuries, but she waved them off. Her eyes were fixed on the tigress, who was now guiding her cubs away from the cliff. She didn't glance back. None of them did. But something about the way they moved, calmer, slower, felt significant. Amelia watched until they disappeared into the tall grass, the forest slowly reclaiming their presence. No one spoke for a while. The wind had stilled and even the birds seemed to hold their voices. Amelia finally stood, brushing off her knees. Her hands were raw, her muscles sore, but a quiet satisfaction settled in her chest. She had done what she came here to do. For now, that was enough. The sun had climbed higher in the sky by the time Amelia and her team made their way back to the station. The rescue had left her both physically drained and mentally alert. She replayed the scene in her head again and again, the way the cub had clung to the ledge, the tigress standing frozen in place, and the moment the cub had been lifted and reunited with its mother. There was a part of her that kept expecting something to go wrong. But nothing had. Somehow, everything had worked exactly as it should have. Inside the ranger outpost, she changed out of her muddy clothes, washed her arms in the sink, and let the cold water run over her fingers for longer than needed. She could still feel the sharp pull in her shoulders from the climb and the trembling of the rope as the cub was lifted. When she looked in the mirror, her face looked the same, but her eyes held a quiet weight. There was something different about surviving a moment like that. It settled into the body slowly, like a shift that couldn't be named right away. The others offered praise and congratulations, though they did so in the calm, modest way common to those who worked with wildlife. Words were quiet, nods were brief. They had all seen close calls before. Still, Amelia could tell the rescue had left an impression. Not just because of the cliff or the cub, but because the mother tiger had not attacked. That part stayed with them. It stayed with Amelia too. In the following days, she resumed her regular patrols. There was no time to rest with the early signs of monsoon season already showing. The skies grew heavier, the air thick with moisture. Trees dripped even when it wasn't raining, and small streams began forming where dry paths used to be. The forest, once open and warm, now felt secretive. The canopy above darkened earlier, and animal tracks became harder to follow in the soft, shifting mud. Amelia returned several times to the cliff where the rescue had happened. She kept a respectful distance but scanned the area, hoping to see a sign of the tigress and her cubs. She knew better than to expect them. Tigers were elusive by nature. Sightings were rare, and even more so after a stressful encounter. Still, something pulled her back again and again. She didn't tell anyone about these extra visits. They felt personal, as if unfinished business lay somewhere among the rocks and grass. A week after the incident, during one of her early morning drives, Amelia spotted fresh paw prints not far from the rescue site. The prints were small but firm. Cub tracks. Her pulse quickened. She followed them cautiously, weaving through the trees until she reached a patch of trampled grass. There, in the soft earth, were larger prints, undeniably from an adult tiger. She knelt beside them, tracing their shape with her fingers. She stayed still for a long time, listening to the rustling branches above, the soft hum of insects below. There was no sound of movement, no growl or shuffle of paws. Only the forest breathing around her. When she stood, she felt a strange sense of comfort. They had been here. Maybe not long ago. Maybe they were still watching. Word of the rescue had spread beyond the reserve. A local newspaper picked it up, running a short piece about the young ranger who helped save a tiger cub. There were no photos, just a brief summary and a few lines about the importance of conservation work. Amelia didn't seek attention. If anything, the sudden curiosity from outsiders made her withdraw further into her routines. One afternoon, she was called to join a briefing about preparations for the monsoon. The rains were coming sooner than predicted, and the staff needed to coordinate their rescue and monitoring strategies. Everyone knew the dangers. Flooding could destroy dens and wash away entire sections of terrain. Animals would be displaced, and some would not survive. It was a time of urgency, of constant vigilance. After the meeting, Amelia returned to her quarters and sat by the window, staring out at the storm clouds gathering beyond the hills. The memory of the cub clinging to the ledge rose again in her mind. She wondered how it was now. If it had fully recovered. If it remembered her. She had read studies about animal memory, particularly among predators. Some experts believed tigers could recognize human faces, scents, or gestures, especially those associated with trauma or kindness. Others dismissed the idea, claiming such beliefs were rooted in emotion, not science. Amelia didn't know where she stood on the matter. But when she thought about the cub's eyes as it looked up at her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something passed between them that day. The forest had its own way of keeping secrets. What it chose to reveal and when was never up to those who walked its paths. For now, she could only continue her work, do her part, and wait to see what the wild would offer next. The weather shifted faster than anyone expected. One morning, the sun would rise in a soft golden glow, warming the leaves and drying the trails. The next, the sky would darken without warning and the rain would begin. Not a soft drizzle, but a steady downpour that lasted for hours, sometimes even days. The forest transformed under its weight. Rivers swelled, lowland paths disappeared, and the once firm soil turned to thick, clinging mud. Amelia adapted quickly. Her jeep was stocked with extra gear, waterproof covers, ropes, and supplies in case she got stuck. Her boots rarely dried between shifts. The radio crackled constantly with updates from other rangers reporting minor landslides, washed-out bridges, and sightings of animals stranded or displaced by the floodwaters. Everyone was on high alert. Every patrol felt heavier, both in weight and responsibility. She kept her focus sharp, but her thoughts often drifted back to the cub and its mother. Though weeks had passed, the memory remained vivid. The way the cub had trembled as she tied the harness. The tension in the tigress's body as she watched from above. It had been one moment in a forest full of moments, yet it stood apart, anchored deep inside her. One afternoon, while returning from a long sweep near the southern edge of the park, Amelia came across a fallen branch tangled in vines. She stepped out to clear the path and noticed something unusual. Embedded in the mud nearby were a new set of tracks. Small, round, and familiar. She crouched, brushing water away from the edges. Cub prints again. Not fresh, but recent enough to hold shape. There was no sign of the tigress this time, but the sight brought a quiet sense of relief. The cub had survived. It was still within the area, still moving alongside its family. She stood and scanned the trees, but the jungle was silent. The tigers, if nearby, remained unseen. By the end of the week, Amelia's body felt the strain. Her hands were blistered from gripping the wheel, her shoulders sore from hauling debris. But she refused to slow down. There was always one more corner to check, one more report to confirm. Sleep came in short stretches. Meals were eaten quickly, often standing. One night, as the rain pounded on the metal roof of the outpost, she sat on her bunk, listening to the storm. Her flashlight cast a dim circle on the wall, flickering as the power flickered with it. She felt the weight of the forest pressing in around her. The trees groaning, rivers rushing, animals sheltering wherever they could. It was during these quiet hours that she started to wonder about something else. What if the rescue hadn't happened? What if she hadn't been there that morning? The cub would have fallen. The tigress might have lost her young. The thought settled heavily in her chest. Not because of guilt, but because of the fragility it exposed. Life in the wild balanced so easily between safety and disaster. A loose rock, a heavy rain, a single moment of distraction, that was all it took. The next day, she drove out to the northern trails, a part of the reserve known for its higher elevation and dense bamboo groves. The path was rough, often narrow, but less prone to flooding. As she moved deeper into the forest, she spotted movement through the trees. A flash of orange and black. She stopped the jeep, heart pounding. For a brief second, a tiger stood on a ridge above her, partially hidden by tall grass. Not a cub, this was a full-grown animal. It stood still, gazing down at her. The rain softened, then stopped altogether. Tom seemed to pause. She didn't move. The tiger's face was streaked with wet fur, its eyes steady and calm. Then it turned and vanished into the trees. She sat in silence for several minutes, unsure if what she had seen was real. It might have been the mother tigress. Or another adult. But something about the gaze, the stillness, it felt familiar. She couldn't prove it. She didn't need to. Later that evening, when she returned to the outpost, she didn't mention the sighting. It was hers to keep. A small moment tucked away between patrol logs and field reports. Something unrecorded but deeply felt. In the days that followed, she found herself more attuned to the forest. Every sound seemed sharper, every shape more defined. She wasn't searching for the tigers anymore, not exactly. But she carried the knowledge of their presence with her. Quiet, powerful, and unseen. What she didn't know, not yet, was that the monsoon had more to bring. The worst was still ahead, hidden behind heavy clouds and distant thunder. And in the coming days, everything she thought she understood about connection, instinct, and survival would be tested in a way she never imagined. The rain returned with a force that surprised even the most experienced rangers. Dark clouds rolled in before dawn, thick and low, wrapping the treetops in an unbroken blanket of gray. By midday, the skies opened fully. Sheets of water poured down over the forest, drowning the usual sounds of birds and insects beneath the constant roar. The air felt heavier, thicker, charged with the kind of energy that made the skin tighten and the stomach clench. Amelia had barely finished her morning check-in when a call came through the radio. One of the outer patrol trails had been completely blocked by a landslide. A large tree had fallen across the path and the route was now inaccessible from the eastern side. The team was stretched thin, some already assisting in rescue operations near the riverbank. Amelia volunteered to assess the damage herself. She loaded her gear quickly, covered the jeep's equipment in waterproof sheeting, and pulled on her rain jacket. The drive was long and slow. Mud pulled at the tires with every turn and visibility was limited to a few feet ahead. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up. Water ran in small rivers along the path and twice she had to stop to remove debris. Still, she pressed on. The idea of an unmonitored trail weighed heavily on her mind. These paths weren't just roads, they were lifelines. Without them, it would be impossible to respond quickly to emergencies. After nearly an hour, she reached the area in question. The trail had vanished beneath a mass of churned-up earth, twisted roots, and a massive fallen tree. She stopped the engine and stepped out into the rain. The impact had been recent. The bark was still damp and raw, and clumps of earth continued to slide in slow motion down the side of the slope. She approached the tree to examine whether any small animals might have been trapped beneath it. Squirrels, birds, snakes all could be hidden under the tangled branches. As she inspected the area, she noted how unstable the slope had become. What was once solid ground now seemed soft and treacherous. Her boots sank into the mud with each step. Still, she moved carefully, weaving through the branches. Something about the way the tree had fallen caught her attention. Its roots had torn up a section of the trail, revealing a deep hollow beneath. If animals had taken shelter there, they might still be inside. She crouched to peer into the space, but before she could get a clear view, a loud crack echoed through the valley. It was a sharp, unmistakable sound with splitting under pressure. She turned her head sharply and saw the top of the ridge begin to shift. The trees swayed unnaturally, their roots loosening from the saturated soil. In seconds, the slope above her gave way. A surge of mud, rocks, and broken vegetation began racing toward her. Her first instinct was to run, but the path back to the jeep was already blocked. The only option was the fallen tree. She threw herself at the trunk, scrambling over its slick surface and climbing as high as she could. Her arms wrapped tightly around the wood as the landslide struck. The impact was violent. Mud slammed into her body, knocking the wind from her lungs. She held on with everything she had, her legs sliding, hands scraping against the bark. A wave of debris flowed over her, pressing her down, filling her mouth and nose with the taste of earth. The sound was deafening. A chaotic mix of snapping branches, rushing water, and roaring wind. When it finally stopped, everything went still. She couldn't move. The world had become dark and silent. Her face was half buried in the mud, but a pocket of air had formed around her mouth. She gasped for breath, coughing and blinking against the grit in her eyes. Her arms and chest were pinned. She tried to shift, but the weight of the debris held her fast. Panic surged for a moment, but she fought it back. She had trained for situations like this, though the reality was far more terrifying than any drill. She took slow breaths, calming herself. She would need to conserve energy, stay focused, and wait for rescue. Her radio was lost somewhere in the fall, and she had no way of calling for help. She didn't know how long she lay there. Time passed strangely in the dark. The sound of rain above continued, muffled now by the weight pressing down. Her mind drifted to the others at the outpost. Would they notice she hadn't returned? Would someone check the trail? She knew the answer wasn't certain. With multiple emergencies unfolding across the reserve, hours could pass before anyone realized she was missing. Her body ached, but she remained still. Any movement could cause another shift. The landslide might not be over. She listened to the faint trickle of water seeping through the mud, to the occasional crack of a branch above. Her world had narrowed to a single breath, a thin pocket of air, and the hope that someone, somehow, would find her in time. And then she heard it. Faint, almost too soft to notice. A sound above her. A rhythmic thump, heavy and deliberate. Not the rain. Not the wind. Something moving. She held her breath, listening harder. There it was again. A soft scrape, then a dull thud. It was close. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the smallest flicker of hope. Something or someone was there. The noise above her didn't go away. It continued in slow, steady intervals, something pushing against the debris, shifting the weight of the mud with careful effort. Amelia tried to move her neck to see, but even the slightest motion sent pressure through her back and shoulders. The air pocket around her face was holding, but just barely. Any movement risked collapsing it. She remained still, her ears straining in the silence. A shape moved across the narrow beam of light, breaking through the mud. For a moment, she thought it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. Then it passed again, more clearly this time. Orange and black. Wet fur, moving with quiet force. The shape was too large to be a monkey, too slow and deliberate to be a bird or small predator. There was no mistaking it. It was a tiger. Her heart beat harder in her chest, though she could barely feel anything under the weight pressing against her. She could not see the tiger's face, only brief glimpses of its flank and shoulder. The stripes were unmistakable. It moved back and forth above the debris, snout close to the ground, paws nudging at the edges. Each motion loosened a little more of the mud. Amelia tried to understand what she was seeing. Tigers did not act this way. They avoided landslide zones. They didn't investigate the scent of humans buried beneath earth and stone. But this one had come. It had found her. And it wasn't leaving. The tiger's weight was enough to shift the top layer of mud. She felt pressure release in short waves as the debris moved around her. It was working through the rubble with care, not in a panic. Like it knew exactly where to go. She wondered if it was the cub she had saved. But that seemed impossible. Tigers grew fast, but not that fast. Then another thought surfaced, perhaps it was the mother. Perhaps she had remembered. The possibility sat in her mind without clear proof, yet it felt true. A loud creak followed. The debris shifted again, and a rush of air hit her face. She gasped, the freshness of it overwhelming after the stale breath she had survived on for so long. Her vision cleared just enough to see a paw. Massive, soaked in mud, but unmistakably feline. The tiger leaned forward, its nose almost touching the ground where her hand was barely visible. Suddenly, the weight on her chest lightened more rapidly. Not just the tiger now? Voices followed. Human voices. Muffled at first, then louder. They were shouting her name. Calling to each other. A flashlight beam swept across the debris, catching the edge of her jacket. She heard boots hitting the ground above, the sound of digging tools striking rocks. The tiger backed away as the humans approached. It didn't run. It simply stepped aside, allowing them space, retreating into the nearby brush. When the first pair of hands reached her, she was already halfway out of the mud. Her left arm was freed first, then her shoulder. The pain came quickly after, shooting through her side like fire, but it meant she could feel again. They cleared the rest of the rubble in coordinated movements. Each minute brought more air, more space. Eventually, she was lifted, her body wrapped in blankets, her face cleaned of dirt and blood. She could barely keep her eyes open, but she saw enough to notice one ranger pointing toward the trees. The others followed his gaze. Through the curtain of rain, the tiger stood just beyond the clearing. Its golden eyes locked with hers. For a long, quiet second, nothing else moved. No one spoke. The tiger's fur was soaked, its chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Then it turned, walked a few steps, and disappeared into the forest. Amelia didn't say anything. There was nothing she could explain. The others had seen it. That was enough. They loaded her into the back of the jeep and began the drive back to the outpost. Her body throbbed with pain, but her thoughts remained fixed on the animal that had come when no one else could have found her. Later, once they were safely inside and she had been treated for bruises and minor injuries, the team spoke about what they had witnessed. Some questioned it. Others called it luck, a coincidence. A tiger drawn by movement or scent. But Amelia remained quiet. She didn't argue. She didn't try to convince anyone. In her mind, she saw the cliff again. The moment the cub was lifted into her arms. The gaze of the tigress that had watched from above. Something had changed that day. And now something had changed again. That night, she lay awake in her bunk, rain tapping gently on the roof. The forest outside had gone still as if catching its breath. And in that silence, she thought not of fear or danger, but of the soft press of paws against mud and the impossible moment when wild instinct had given way to something else entirely. Morning came slowly, as if the forest itself were recovering from the night before. The clouds still lingered, but the rain had eased into a soft drizzle. The usual chatter of birds was missing, replaced by the occasional creak of soaked branches and the steady drip of water from leaf to leaf. Inside the outpost, the atmosphere was quiet. A few rangers moved between rooms, exchanging updates in hushed voices, careful not to disturb the injured woman resting in the far corner. Amelia sat propped against a pillow, wrapped in a thin blanket. Her body ached in every limb, but her mind remained clear. Sleep had come in short bursts, interrupted by flashes of memory, the rush of mud, the breathless silence, the tiger's eyes in the rain. She hadn't spoken much since her rescue, answering only what was necessary. The others respected her space, though she could feel their curiosity hanging in the air. A ranger brought her tea and sat nearby, sharing updates from other parts of the reserve. Minor landslides had blocked several more trails. 2 deer had been found trapped in rising water and were rescued by another team. Power would be unreliable for the next few days. Amelia nodded, grateful for the normalcy in the details. It grounded her. Later in the day, she stepped outside for a short walk. The path behind the outpost was slick with mud, but she moved carefully, favoring her sore leg. The air was damp and earthy, filled with the scent of wet leaves and moss. She followed the trail toward the lookout point just above the western valley, a place she had often visited before. From there, the landscape stretched far and wide, the canopy thick and trembling with moisture. She stood quietly for a while, watching the mist curl between the trees. Her thoughts wandered to the tiger. There had been no sign of it since the rescue. No paw prints near the outpost. No distant roars. Nothing but the fading image in her memory, its soaked fur, its steady gaze, its silence. She knew that wild animals didn't behave this way. Even those raised near humans remained unpredictable, cautious, often distant. And yet something had drawn the tiger to her. It hadn't wandered past by accident. The way it dug through the mud, the way it remained calm as the rangers approached, it all suggested intention. She couldn't explain it. But deep inside, she believed it had recognized her. When she returned to the main building, one of the younger rangers approached her. He had been part of the rescue team. His voice was quiet, respectful. He asked if she wanted to see the camera trap footage they had retrieved from the area 2 days before. She agreed, and they went inside to view it together. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy footage of the forest floor. Shadows moved across it, monkeys, birds, a passing boar. Then the frame shifted, showing the trail leading up to the landslide zone. In one clip, taken just before the collapse, a tiger appeared. It walked slowly, sniffing the air, then paused near the path, ears twitching. It stayed for nearly a full minute before the camera cut off. The next video picked up hours later. The same tiger returned, this time approaching the pile of debris. It circled once, then began to paw at the dirt. The ranger paused the footage and looked at her. There was no commentary, just a glance of quiet understanding. Amelia studied the screen. The tiger's behavior was careful, precise. Not the frantic digging of a predator searching for prey. Not the idle pacing of a restless animal. It had gone there with purpose. She spent the rest of the day resting, watching the rain return and fade again. The storm had passed, but the forest remained soaked and heavy. Small streams carved new paths through the reserve. Branches hung low under the weight of water. Everything looked changed, but alive. That evening, as dusk settled in, Amelia sat outside the outpost again. The jungle was quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that made every sound stand out, a twig snapping, a leaf falling, a bird fluttering its wings. Then, from the far edge of the trees, she heard something else. A soft rustle followed by a low breath. She turned, heart thudding. Standing just beyond the first row of trees was the tiger. Not moving forward, not retreating. Just watching. It remained there for a few seconds, long enough for her to see the mud still clinging to its fur, the dampness in its coat, the slight tilt of its head. Then it turned, stepped into the shadows, and disappeared. She didn't move. Didn't speak. Just breathed in the cool air and closed her eyes for a moment. Somewhere, between instinct and memory, something had passed between them. Something real. The next few days moved slowly, wrapped in a hush that lingered even after the rain had finally stopped. The forest, heavy with moisture, began to stir again. Birds returned to their morning songs. Small animals ventured from their burrows, shaking off the wetness and resuming their cautious routines. The rangers worked steadily, repairing damaged trails and checking on known dens, nests, and watering holes. Life pushed forward, though everything felt slightly altered, as if the jungle itself had been reminded of its fragility. Amelia eased back into her duties with care. Though the pain in her ribs still flared when she moved too quickly, she didn't want to sit idle. She helped update the animal tracking logs, sorted equipment, and joined brief patrols close to the outpost. Her mind stayed sharp, but it often drifted, especially when the wind shifted or a shadow moved just out of view. Her colleagues still spoke in low voices about the tiger. They were careful not to exaggerate. They didn't need to. The facts were unusual enough on their own. A tiger had shown up at the exact place a human lay buried. It had acted calmly, dug deliberately, and stayed even when others arrived. Most admitted they had never seen anything like it. Some of the older rangers tried to explain it through patterns of scent, instinct, or chance. Others avoided the subject altogether, unsure how to make sense of it. But a few quietly admitted they believed there was more to it. Something unspoken. A kind of memory passed between species. A recognition that didn't rely on words or logic. Amelia didn't argue or add her thoughts unless asked. She wasn't interested in proving anything. What mattered to her wasn't explanation, it was experience. And what she had experienced in those moments beneath the mud and again when the tiger reappeared had changed the way she saw everything around her. The tiger didn't return in the following days. No tracks near the outpost. No new sightings on camera. But Amelia didn't expect it to. Tigers were solitary, always moving, always unseen unless they chose otherwise. Still, each morning she found herself watching the tree line, just for a moment, before continuing her tasks. One afternoon, while checking the western observation point, Amelia paused to scan the valley with her binoculars. The canopy stretched far into the distance, broken only by a few tall trees and the curve of the river below. As she adjusted the focus, her eyes landed on a familiar patch of clearing near the old cliff site. There, standing alone among the grass, was a tiger. It wasn't close. It didn't move. But its posture was unmistakable. It faced the forest, not the observation point, as if simply surveying its home. Amelia watched without blinking, her hands steady despite the wind. She didn't know if it was the same animal, though her instincts told her it was. The tiger remained for several minutes before turning and slipping back into the trees. It left no trail, no noise, only the image burned into her mind. She lowered the binoculars and sat down on the nearby rock, letting the silence fill her. That evening, word of the sighting spread quickly. Other rangers hoped to catch a glimpse too, but no one did. Amelia didn't share many details. She didn't need to. She had seen what she came to see. The following morning brought a sense of clarity. She rose early and packed her gear with more purpose. Her body still bore the marks of the landslide, but her steps were steadier. She joined a patrol headed east, not far from where the tiger had last been seen. The forest was alive with sound, branches cracking, leaves rustling, birds calling from above. Near a bend in the path, she found fresh tracks again. Large, clear, leading away from the trail and into a shaded grove. She crouched to examine them. The soil was still soft from the recent rain and the prints were unmistakably recent. The tiger had passed through not long ago. She stood and looked into the trees. The path ahead was dense, overgrown. She didn't follow. Some part of her knew the tiger didn't want to be followed. It had chosen to be seen and that moment had already passed. Back at the outpost, she updated the tracking chart, marked the prints, and closed the notebook without saying much. But as the day wore on, she noticed a shift in the way others looked at her. Not with surprise or disbelief, but with a quiet kind of respect. Something had changed. Not just for her, but for all of them. The tiger, once a symbol of fear or fascination, had become something more. A reminder that the line between the wild and the human was not as rigid as they thought. And though the jungle would always be unpredictable, vast, and filled with danger, Amelia knew now that it also held space for something else. Something rare. Something wordless. Something that would stay with her long after the mud had dried and the trails were cleared again. The days stretched into weeks and the jungle began to dry. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopy more often, warming the forest floor and lifting the scent of damp earth into the air. Small creatures became more active, trails hardened under the wheels of jeeps, and the mood among the rangers lightened. With each passing day, it seemed the monsoon was finally loosening its grip. Amelia returned fully to her routines, though something inside her had shifted. She no longer walked the trails with the same kind of urgency. Instead, her movements carried a deeper attentiveness. She noticed things she used to overlook: the fresh growth on a low branch, the distant call of a bird she hadn't heard in months, the faint paths animals left in tall grass. Her work had not changed, but her way of moving through it had. The tiger had not been seen again. Its absence was expected, even natural. Tigers lived in silence, in solitude, emerging only when they wished. But the story remained. The moment had rooted itself into the fabric of daily life at the outpost. Rangers spoke of it not with drama but with quiet recognition. It had become a reference point, a shared truth that no longer needed to be questioned or proven. People from nearby towns started visiting the reserve more frequently, curious after hearing about the unusual rescue. Journalists came asking questions, hoping for a photograph or a detailed statement. Amelia spoke with a few, always keeping her words measured. She told them only what they needed to know: that the forest was unpredictable, that wild animals were more intelligent than people gave them credit for, and that sometimes something rare happens that reminds humans how little they understand. Visitors came and went, and eventually the story began to settle. The reserve returned to its rhythm. But even as the noise faded, something deeper remained. It showed in the way new rangers asked questions with more patience, how the experienced ones paused before removing a branch that might be hiding a nest. There was a subtle shift in the way people saw the animals, not just as subjects of study or danger, but as beings capable of choice, memory, even care. Amelia felt it most when she was alone in the forest. She would stop at places where nothing was happening, simply listening. It wasn't about waiting for another dramatic moment. It was about being present in a space where anything could happen, and sometimes did. One morning, she sat near a small watering hole, sketching tracks into her notebook. A family of deer approached cautiously, ears flicking, noses raised. They drank for a few minutes before melting back into the trees. The stillness that followed was deep and unbroken. And in that stillness, she thought about the tiger again, not just the one from the landslide, but all the others moving through the trees, unseen and unbothered. She wondered if the cub had grown stronger, more confident. If it remembered the moment it hung from the cliff's edge. If it carried a memory of her hands, the harness, the soft voice she had used as she worked. There was no way to know. But then again, memory didn't always need to be proved to be real. Some evenings, as the sun slipped behind the trees and the forest turned gold, she walked to the clearing near the western ridge. She would stand in silence, not calling out or expecting anything. And every so often, just for a breath of time, she would feel something watching her. Not in fear. Not in threat. Just watching. The connection hadn't faded. It had simply grown quiet, like a current beneath still water. A few rangers began recording more stories about unusual animal behavior, elephants appearing at the same hour each morning near the edge of the river, a leopard that returned to the same branch after every rainstorm, a herd of somber deer that stood guard while one of their own gave birth. Each story was told without exaggeration, shared during meals or passed quietly in reports. They weren't trying to explain or romanticize. They were learning to witness. Amelia often wrote at night, her journal filling with sketches, observations, and reflections she couldn't voice out loud. She never mentioned the tiger directly by name, but its presence lived in every page. Not just as an animal, but as a turning point. She had come to the reserve to study wildlife, to protect and preserve it. She never expected the wild to acknowledge her in return. And now that it had, she carried that acknowledgement carefully, like a fragile thread that connected her to something larger than herself. What had happened wasn't just a rescue or a coincidence. It was a story of survival, yes, but also of recognition. Of a bond that ignored language and species. A moment that quietly rewrote everything she thought she understood about the space between humans and the wild. The light fell differently on the reserve that morning. It was softer, more golden, and the breeze carried the clean scent of wildflowers and new leaves. The rains were gone, and the forest had shifted once more into its dry season rhythm. The ground was firm again, the rivers calmer, and the trees rustled with the movement of life returning to routine. Even the birds seemed to sing with less urgency and more ease. Amelia started her day early, not from obligation but from habit. She had grown into the rhythm of the land, her body waking before the sky changed, her steps guided more by instinct than planning. There were no urgent tasks waiting, no critical reports or broken paths. It was simply a day to walk. She chose a route that wound through open meadows, small hills, and familiar patches of brush. Places she had walked 100 times before, but which always looked different depending on the light, the season, or the mood of the forest. Her jeep remained parked under the shade of a tree. Today, she wanted the sound of her own steps, the feel of earth beneath her boots. Hours passed quietly. She stopped to listen to a woodpecker, watched a monkey leap from one tree to another, and knelt beside a patch of disturbed soil where something had clearly rested overnight. No rush. No destination. By midday, she reached a low ridge overlooking the valley where the rescue had taken place. The cliff had changed since then. Vegetation had begun to reclaim the scar left by the landslide. Grass had pushed up through the cracks, and small ferns clung to the edges. It looked like nothing extraordinary had ever happened there. She sat on a flat rock and pulled out her notebook. She didn't write. Just held it for a while, flipping through pages filled with notes, sketches, and dates. Each one marking a step in her time here. Each one a reminder of how much had happened in such a short span. From where she sat, she could see the path that led through the trees and eventually curved back toward the outpost. She knew every turn of that path. Every branch that leaned a little too low, every stone half buried in the dirt. And it was on that path that she saw movement. A shape emerged between the trees. It moved without sound, smooth and confident. She recognized the pattern before she recognized the body. Black stripes over orange fur. A steady pace. A calm presence. The tiger stepped into the clearing. It did not roar or pause dramatically. It simply walked forward, head level, eyes focused. Its first shone in the sunlight, the muscles beneath rippling with quiet strength. It walked past the cliff edge and stopped near the tall grass. Amelia remained still. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper. Something like reverence. The tiger turned slightly as if aware of her presence. Their eyes met again. No rush in its gaze. No alarm. Only stillness. A quiet moment stretched between them, long and full, without a single sound. Then the tiger turned back to the trees and walked away. She sat for a long time after it disappeared, unsure of how to explain the peace that had settled inside her. It wasn't excitement or triumph. It wasn't even awe anymore. It was something gentler. Like recognition. Like the end of a conversation that needed no words. She rose slowly and began the walk back. The forest around her buzzed softly with life. She didn't need to see the tiger again. That final moment had been enough. A closing of something sacred. A quiet reminder that the connection had never been imagined. Back at the outpost, life continued. Rangers prepared for their afternoon rounds. Reports were reviewed. Radios buzzed. Amelia joined in, laughing softly with one of the newer team members who struggled to untangle a harness strap. The day passed like any other. But every so often as she moved through her duties, she would glance out the window toward the forest. Not with expectation, but with quiet understanding. And in time, the story of the woman and the tiger became more than a tale passed among rangers. It became something people told their children. Something that made visitors pause when they looked into the trees. Something that reminded them, gently and without need for proof, that the wild was not just a place of danger or wonder, but a place of memory, of trust, and sometimes of silent return. Amelia never tried to explain it. Not in full. Some things she knew were meant to be felt rather than told. And she carried the feeling with her always. In her breath. In her steps. In the quiet moments when the forest spoke and she knew how to listen.